You can hear the lightning before you see it. First, a low, electric drum under the skin of the world. Then a white scream that splits the sky. It comes in sheets now, a relentless stitch along the horizon. And the nights are no longer nights but theatre for endless flashes. The clouds have the colour of old copper and rot. They glow from within like a fever. The last time the sky tried to bless us with blue, someone on a rooftop cried and wept as if it were a miracle. Blue is a memory we trade in whispers. Where rivers used to move like arteries, there are scars, ribbons of salt and cracked clay. Once familiar waterways are choked with silt or swallowed by the sea that crept inland and never stopped. Coastlines that held markets and ferries are now drowned skeletons of concrete, their piers upright like broken teeth. Inland, the soil has baked and powdered. Fields are nothing more than parchment. Lakes are basins of glass-black mud, holding the skulls of dead fish and the echoes of propped planes that never returned. Fire came first for some of us. The forests learned how to burn faster than they could grow, and the fires learned how to ride the wind. Whole neighborhoods collapsed into orange curtains. And when the flames were done, ash settled into the lungs of the living like a second slow death. Then came the smoke seasons, months of choking, a sky the color of old paper, and the taste of burnt toast in every mouth. The map of the country is now a patchwork, scorched wildernesses, drowned suburbs, and islands of salvage where people cluster like barnacles. The storms teach other lessons. Lightning that used to strike a tree now strikes the transformers, the last remaining solar farms, the thin rows of wind turbines. Power comes as a rumor, an occasional ghost when some jury-rigged generator coughs to life, and then the storm takes it back. We learned quickly to stop depending on the grid. We learned to listen, on radios, on the wind, on the cadence of footsteps in the dark. Cities look like abandoned zoos. Skyscrapers are shells, glass blown out like spent teeth, steel bent into obscene sculptures. The freeway system is a field of collapsed girders and the rusted skeletons of cars. Once loved machines, now graves of polyurethane and ash. Landmarks are either swallowed or unrecognizable. The cathedral, with half its nave missing, the stadium turned into a rain-collecting basin. The museum where the skylights are gone, and the paintings are curled and mold-eaten. The skyline is a jagged question mark. You can stand on a rooftop and navigate by smoke plumes and by the slow, steady beacons of people who still try to make themselves seen. What remains of government smells faintly of old paper and fear. Local councils exist in scavenged town halls and library basements, voices raised in a language of ration lists and curfews. Formal authority, police precincts, courts, the teeth of federal systems, eroded when supply convoys stopped coming. Where the state receded, informal power took root. Scavenger crews who mark territories with spray paint, religious communes that trade forgiveness for labor, militias with the rusted bravado of men who have nothing left to lose. There are markets now that move by barter, cans for batteries, books for water, tabled on overturned crates under plastic tarps. Survivor groups are a new geography. Some are loose, traveling bands that choose the roads at night and sleep in abandoned warehouses. Others are tight, heavily guarded compounds where people trade freedom for safety and safety for rules. There are those who scavenge like artists, picking intact radios and old medical supplies, sewing torn clothes into something that will last. There are also the raiders, quick, cruel, organized like storms. They take what they can and leave a clean wound in their wake. Institutions that once promised continuity now hold different roles. The university that trained engineers is a clinic and a seed bank. The local library is a communal store of knowledge and a place where people still teach their children to read by candlelight. Churches and mosques have become meeting halls and food distribution points. The television networks collapsed early, electrical demand too high, transmitters an easy target. Radio survived, oddly, because it is resilient and cheap. The airwaves are the last public square. A voice on a radio can gather a small town like a moth to a porch light. That voice becomes authority, becomes hope, or a siren. We mark the dates by weather events now instead of calendars. The great flood that claimed the river city, everyone calls it the swallowing, is a landmark in our stories. A slow, grinding verdict on the arrogance that called itself progress. The drought that followed was a punishment no one deserved, but all of us received. Crops failed in patterns that could not be predicted. And the grain silos that once promised abundance are now hollow bellies where bandits sleep. Survival is close to physics. Water is a question of catchment and careful boiling. Food is about seeds and slow, patient engineering of soil. Shelter is about insulation from heat and the ability to close against rain that carries poison and the kind of lightning that finds the weak joints of your makeshift home. We have learned to harvest storms in small ways: barrels and tarps, condenser coils scavenged from old refrigeration units. Rain, when it comes, demands attention. Collect it, filter it, worship it. Even in all this wreckage, the world keeps producing small, stubborn life. Moss clings to the north side of a broken statue. A stubborn fig tree fruited last spring between two collapsed townhouses, and a child found the fig and did not trade it, not even for a battery. That is the kind of miracle we notice now, the kind that keeps us walking. But every miracle is followed by the knowledge that the storms will come again, that the lightning will find new routes, that the map will be redrawn overnight. We live under a sky that refuses to be quiet. We live with the sound of static and the slow drip of water in a barrel. We live with the knowledge that the next weather could be kinder or crueler, and that there is no way to be sure. The world is smaller, meaner, and painfully honest. We move through it one wire and one radio broadcast at a time, always listening for the next bolt, always counting what we have left. They call me the voice when they answer the radio. Some call me by the time-worn name I still carry, my mother's name tucked under my tongue like a prayer. But most nights, to the ones huddled in basements and behind corrugated roofs, I am whatever crackle and counsel comes through the speaker. The microphone doesn't flatter me. It reduces me to my breathing and the steady tap of my fingers on a desk that has seen better days. It's enough. Before the sky unraveled, I worked with sound and circuits. I tuned speakers, rebuilt amplifiers, convinced reluctant transistors to sing. There was a small studio downtown, a place with a leaky roof and a cheap espresso machine we pretended was essential. We played records and told jokes, and pretended the world outside hadn't begun to fray at the seams. I thought my job was to entertain. I didn't see that it would become my way to keep other people breathing. Now the studio is a fortress of salvaged plywood and tarpaulin, a hinge between two broken blocks of apartments. The sign that used to announce weekday shows hangs crooked, half buried in ash. My equipment is a collage, a battered transmitter from a church down the road, a tube amp I coaxed awake with a handful of spare valves, a pedal generator. I pedaled until my thighs burned and the neighbor's child slept through the hum. I keep 3 batteries for the transmitter, scavenged from an ambulance that caught fire last winter. I have a small solar mat patched with duct tape, a coil taken from an upright refrigerator that condenses humidity when the nights are cold enough to make it work. None of it is elegant. It is all stubborn. Survival in this world is a ledger of small truths. You conserve heat, you collect rain, you make friends who can weld and barter, and watch the perimeter while you sleep. I wake early to check the catchment barrels, sweeping out algae with a brush that used to be my wife's. The same brush that now lives in a plastic bucket beside the water heater we jury-rigged from a collapsed water main. I boil what I can, then run it through a cloth and a bed of charcoal I keep in a tin. When I can't boil, when fuel is scarce, I use the sun trap method. Clear bottles on a raised surface until the UV takes enough of the pathogens down not to matter. I can teach you how to make coffee from acorn flour and how to strain nettles to make a broth that tastes like something human again. These are the things my voice carries across the airwaves. Recipes turned into lifelines. I get by because I hoard knowledge as much as goods. I trade lessons for canned beans. I teach a woman 2 blocks over how to splice a damaged antenna in exchange for a week's worth of dried fruit. I keep maps on the wall, hand-drawn lines that show the safe crossings, the ruins where medicine sometimes surfaces, the fields where the seeds still germinate if planted at the right depth. People call in and tell me what they've learned. I keep a ledger of names and tips in a notebook whose pages smell faintly of smoke. That notebook is one of my treasures. It's how I remember that somebody taught me to splice cokes with a shoelace, and how a boy named Matteo once fixed my transmission by holding a rusted bolt in place while I tightened the clamp. What keeps me moving is both heavy and fragile. There's the practical, responsibility. A radio voice is a small governance. I read the weather reports pieced together from barometer readings and overheard murmurs. I announce when storms pivot out of the west. I warn of raiders sighted on the northern road. On a bad night, when the lightning is more frequent and the static eats the transmission, there are callers who will sit up for hours waiting for me to say the words that make them feel less alone. That matters. It is a power that doesn't feel like power. It is the duty of giving people a reason to lock their doors and listen for the morning. There are other, softer engines. I keep a list of names. Names of people who used to be whole in other lives, who asked me once to say their names on the air if anything happened. On quiet nights, I read them aloud like an inventory of ghosts. Clara from the bakery, who taught me to fold dough with my hands. Hassan the bike mechanic. Sarah with a laugh like a bell, who taught my niece to whistle. Saying these names is an act of preservation. It is a way to stitch a web between the scattered islands of survivors. For some who listen, hearing a name is a sign that someone remembers them, and memory feels like shelter. Loss is a weight I carry without a shoulder strap. My marriage ended slowly, like a leak you notice too late. After the food routes failed and we argued about whether to stay and hold the house or walk and look for water, we parted not with a single dramatic moment, but with a series of small resignations. I found her a year later in a market that had been looted. She didn't recognize me at first. We spoke for an hour, shared a can of peaches, and said the things people say to close chapters. I'm sorry. I'm tired. I hope you find safety. She moved on with a group that traded in the inland marshes. I did not see her again. My child, if I say that word the sentence changes shape, was small and clever, and stole batteries from my workshop to make tiny toys flash. We used to sit beneath a window and read by the light of a borrowed lamp. I remember teaching them to hold the ham radio microphone, to press the PTT switch with careful fingers. The last transmission I remember them making was a wobbling hello that I played back over and over for days until the grooves of the recorder wore thin. I don't know if they died in a storm or a raid, or simply fell ill in a place where the nearest clinic had closed. I have forgiven myself 1,000 times, and not once have I forgotten the way their small hand fit in mine. Guilt is its own weather system. I am aware of the ledger of choices. Who I helped, who I turned away. There are nights when I replay every call and wonder if my decision to trade a can of soup for a battery kept someone alive or consigned them to walking in the wrong direction. I make mistakes. I have given shelter to people who later stole from the weak. I have refused entrance to those who asked with trembling hands and the right face. Each decision adds a bruise. Physical wear is obvious. My hands are creased and cracked from working with wire and boiling water. I have a long white scar along my forearm from a night I cut myself on a jagged sheet of metal while repairing a roof in a windstorm. My spine aches in the cold. I sleep in fits, always one ear tuned to the radio frequency I relay for neighborly chatter. I am not young. My hair has gone the color of the ash we sweep from the hearth. Yet there is resilience in the smallness of my rituals. I sweep the dust from the microphone before each broadcast. I wind the generator once an hour with a pedaled motion that keeps me honest and awake. I keep a jar of a strange tea that calms the tremor when it comes. I write letters that I never send, short, blunt notes that begin with, "If you're reading this," and end with grudging gratitude. I repair what I can. I teach others how to repair what I cannot. Hope is not a single bright thing. It is a network of small, renewable practices. There was a spring in the garden behind the university, now a seed bank, that produced a handful of heirloom beans last season. We split them into quarters and planted with a sacramental care. 3 children in the neighborhood learned to free their hands from despair by tending those sprouts. I broadcast their success like a report from another planet. 2 green leaves, then 4. If I can get someone to believe they might have peas in the fall, they'll trade me a week's guard duty. If they can believe the soil might hold, they'll carry water carefully and not waste it. Hope is pragmatic here. It is work. I am not a hero. I am a tired man pressed into usefulness by the simple fact that the microphone responds to pressure and the world still listens. Some nights I am cruel, terse with callers who waste time, blunt with the desperate. Some nights I am tender, reading letters that arrive by hand and dried in a book where they will not fade. Mostly I am ordinary, a person who learned to splice, to scavenge, to coax a radio, to carry a human voice across a landscape that has forgotten the sound of ordinary life. When the lightning comes and the sky opens with that white fury, I keep the transmitter warm and the call sign steady. I speak into the static about the weather and about small mercies, about where food might be found and where to avoid. I speak the names that are left to me, and sometimes I sing. One line from a record I remember, or a lullaby my child liked. The music complicates the mathematics of survival. It makes listeners stop counting losses for a breath. It makes them remember that there was once an afternoon when the sky was blue and music had no urgency. That is why I keep going. Not for fame, not even primarily for duty. for the simple, stubborn human thing, connection. I am a conduit for others' breaths. I stitch together the scattered threads of people with a frequency and a few soldered joints. It is not enough to rebuild the world. It might, however, be enough to keep people walking toward one another instead of away. And if, in time, the dark sky quiets and the map is redrawn in kinder ink, maybe the voice will be a relic of survival and not a last resort. Until then, I tune the dials and listen. And when a caller says, "I heard you," I answer the way someone at the shore answers the name of a swimmer. Keep moving toward the light. They tell stories about how crises come quietly, like a whisper at first. Little things you can ignore until they are too loud to miss. Ours arrived more like a drum roll that never stopped. The lightning taught us the rhythm. It arrived in new patterns, more often, farther inland, striking places that once felt safe. It was the signal that the old rules had ended. The primary crisis is not a single thing you can name and knot with a ribbon. It is a braided catastrophe. Drought braided with saltwater intrusion, wildfire braided with electric storms, a breakdown of supply lines braided with human cruelty. Together they make a weather that hunts people. For us, the immediate knife edge is water, where it comes from, how to keep it, and how to keep it from turning our crops and wells to poison. Our river, what used to be the river everyone used as a reference on maps, has been hollowed to a string of oxbows and ponds that silt up and stink in the heat. Rainfall patterns changed like a gambler's mood. Months of bone-dry calm, then storms that bring a day's worth of water in an hour, only to evaporate the next sun. The ocean, which once was a border, walked inland slowly and now walks with a purpose. Tide crept, and with tide came salt. Low-lying aquifers have been salted. Wells that used to taste faintly of iron now taste like the inside of a kettle. When we sample the groundwater now, the readings show sodium where we once expected calcium. Salt kills roots. Salt kills hope. There is a physical explanation for what we live through, not that the explanation comforts us. Heat calls more moisture up from whatever pools and puddles we have left. Warmer air holds more water vapor. When it cools, it releases that water faster and more violently. That is why storms arrive with a violence that belongs to another era. Lightning is more frequent because stronger convection creates taller, more charged clouds. Lightning follows the charge, and our transformers and solar arrays are convenient conductors. Wildfires follow drought, and then create their own microclimates, pushing winds and embers farther than memory would allow. Melted permafrost and burning peat release carbon and unseen chemicals into the air. The atmosphere changes its chemistry little by little, and the weather systems rearrange. The cycles that used to make spring predictable, summer tolerable, and fall harvestable no longer apply. For us, the mechanistic detail is not an abstract lesson. It is the ledger we read every morning. The storm that cleared the southern ridge last month stripped 3 solar blankets off their mounts and took 2 water tanks with it. The lightning that hit the old transformer sent a surge that fried the diode array on the transmitter. I had to take the whole rig down for 3 days and patch it with an old rectifier we pulled from the hospital's scrap heap. Our fuel stores are melted down to the last little tins of stove gel. The one time a supply convoy tried to come through, we watched the horizon for 3 days until a plume of smoke told us the convoy had been ambushed near the collapsed bridge. The supplies went up in a line of fire we could see from the ridge. Tinned beans and medicine and a folded mattress, gone in an hour. Human systems fray faster than metal. Hospitals have become triage tents where a single nurse handles cuts and infection and burns because the surgical suites need power. Pharmacies are relics. Antibiotics are hoarded like gospel paper, and when they run out, infections again become mortal. The police presence that used to mean law and a uniform is a memory. Small militias patrol sectors with familiarity and cruelty. Food distribution is largely informal. Someone's garden here, a guarded pantry there. The old global supply chains vanished when the ships took on water, or the ports were claimed by gangs. Without those chains, cities starve slowly. Encounters with other survivors are the currency of the day. Some are loans repaid in kindness. Others are loans that come back in violence. A few people cross my microphone and become more than voices. Rosa, who runs a hydroponic patch under a collapsed mall skylight. Eli, who can solder the impossible back into life. Margot, who organizes the women who watch the children and trade lessons about bread. These are allies who show up in person sometimes, trading knowledge or a jar of pickles for a night on an extra blanket. There are also those who came with maps and promises and left with our food. Raiders move in patterns. First a scouting run, camouflaged as trade, then the rip. They have learned how desperate we are, and that desperation is a harvest. Survival is becoming harder each day because the stockpiles run down, and the environment changes in ways we cannot reverse locally. Seed varieties bred for an old precipitation curve fail in the new spikes and droughts. Older people die of lack of insulin, of untreated infections, of exposure in nights that now stray to bitter cold after days of heat. Fuel is a rumor. Batteries die and cannot be replaced. Replacement parts for radios and pumps come from other places, and those places have other priorities, if they exist at all. We face specific limitations: water, energy, medicine, and trust. Water. We used to rely on a network of municipal treatment that took river water, filtered and chlorinated it, then pushed it to taps. Municipal systems need electricity and maintenance. When both vanished, municipal water systems became liabilities. Pipes burst in freeze-thaw cycles, storage tanks breached, and clean water turned into a disease vector. Where municipal supplies failed, people dug wells or revived cisterns. But wells are vulnerable. Pump motors need batteries or fuel. Surface contamination from floodwaters brings pathogens. Saltwater intrusion renders wells useless for agriculture. Our mitigation is rudimentary. We collect rooftop rain in barrels. We build sand and charcoal filters in layers. We use SODIS, placing clear bottles in the sun to let UV and heat reduce pathogens. And we build crude solar stills at the edge of any swamp or brackish pond to distill water. None of these methods is perfect, and all are labor-intensive. Energy. Solar panels survive if the lightning does not find them. Most panels are in arrays with worn wiring and no surge protection. Wind turbines, if they still spin, are often missing blades. Fuel for generators is a dwindling smell in the air. We learn to conserve, power the transmitter only during peak hours, run the pump in short bursts, avoid unnecessary refrigeration, but conservation only buys time. Medicine, antibiotics, insulin, and anesthesia are rare. We can stitch, set broken bones, and treat minor burns. For anything more, we rely on scrounge stock and luck. Preventive medicine, keeping clean boiling water, isolating infectious cases, is where we spend our daily effort. Trust, that's the slowest thing to rebuild. Every kindness is measured against the possibility of theft or betrayal. We build walls and barters and keep watch. We trust the voice on the radio because it is less likely to be a con than a stranger at dawn with polished promises. We measure people by their consistency. Do they show up when they say they will? Do they trade fairly? Do they patrol, then disappear? Amid this, the science is our liturgy. I teach callers simple diagnostics. Taste water cautiously. If it tastes faintly salty or metallic, don't use it on seedlings. Test it in stages. If the leaves of your garden curl like pressed hands, you have either too much salt or too little water. If the leaves turn pale between veins, you have nitrogen deficiency or root shock. Mulch is our miracle. Lay straw thick. The soil temperature holds, evaporation slows, and worms return. Plant in swales that catch the rain and let it soak instead of running. If you have a grey water system, kitchen water from rinsing grains and vegetables, use it to feed non-food plants or trees, and not your salad green. Compost everything that is not diseased. Compost heats and returns nitrogen. Save seeds from the bitterest plants. Those will breed traits for resilience. I talk about timelines in radio language because the airwaves are how we coordinate labor. If the cloud bands hold off for 3 days, I'll say, send 2 people to the old seed bank with a tarp and a crowbar. Wear gloves. Expect rats. I don't say expect raiders, if I can avoid it. Naming fear sometimes brings it, but we prepare. A convoy travels at dawn, with 2 people acting as scouts and 1 carrying a hammer and a tarp. We leave markers on the road, small piles of stones, to signal safe turns. I coach people on how to move in silence, how to carry a canteen without clinking, how to use the sun's angle to navigate when compasses are old. There are moments of ingenuity that feel like prayer. Eli built a pump from an old windshield wiper motor and a pressure tank from a submarine canister. Rosa rerouted a mall skylight into a hydroponic trough and feeds lettuce with nutrient solution made from compost tea. Hydration bladders from backpacks are pressed into duty for rain capture. Plastic sheeting from the hospital turns into distillation blankets. These hacks are small revolutions. They do not fix the larger climate. They let a family survive the summer. But the crisis escalates in ways that frustrate ingenuity. A storm last month carried a cloud of metallic dust from a burned-out industrial site. The dust settled on leaves and blocked stomata, reducing photosynthesis. We watched a patch of beans yellow within days, as if someone had turned a dimmer switch on the sun. Lightning has taught us avoidance. Keep the transmitter grounded with a long wire and a deep pit around the mast. When a storm approaches, shut down non-essential circuits. Even with precautions, you cannot eliminate risk. The world keeps inventing new ways to be against you. The real terror is the social cascade. When one neighborhood falls, the others feel it like a physical shockwave. A losing fight over water in the east sends families walking west, and with them, disease and stories of what was taken. The rumor mill is as dangerous as any storm. A whisper that there's a cache of canned food 40 miles north will empty a town as families walk, carrying all they can. Those walks are dangerous. The landscape is now a map of desperate choices. Our radio has become a kind of triage center. People call in desperate for help. We have 3 children and only 1 bottle of water. There's a fever here that started yesterday. We heard a group of raiders at the old mill. I answer with the best I can. Advice about wound care. A coordinate for a supply drop if one exists. The time a scout might arrive. I can warn. Sometimes I can dispatch a person or 2 who will trade a can for labor. Sometimes my voice alone is a comfort that holds a family together for a night. The conflict is not simply external. Inside the community, there are arguments that feel like weather themselves, over how to ration, whether to trade with a neighboring militia, whether to open the walls and accept refugees. Each decision can tilt the fragile balance between survival and collapse. I have been part of both decisions. I held the gate closed for a week against a party of ragged travelers. I opened it for a child who cried like a bell and would not stop. The ledger of those choices follows me. At night, when the lightning makes the sky a strobe, I map the possibilities in my head. If the storm tears the solar array again, we are down for days. If the raiders come during the blackout, they will be able to move in on soft signals. If the river floods its remaining oxbows, it will bring fresh silt, but also new contamination. The crisis rolls forward, and every solution requires labor and a risk assessment. Who will go to fetch the distillation parts? Who will stand watch? Who will tend the compost? Who will be left behind if we must move? We are improvisers at the edge of a world rewritten by heat and water. The science tells us the patterns. Our lives are the experiments. We do not have the luxury of long-term planning as institutions once defined it. We plan for the next storm, the next harvest, the next call on the radio. We trade knowledge like currency and cling to alliances like rope. In that precarious architecture, hope is not an abstract. It is a plan scribbled on an envelope. 2 people go fetch the pump if the cloud breaks. Everyone covers the seedlings with a tarp if the wind shifts from the north. It is small. It is actionable. It is for now enough. The crisis has turned our days into lists. We read the lists aloud over the air. Check barrels, mend lines, watch for smoke. The weather reads back in thunder. The lightning keeps teaching us new vocabulary. We learn. We build. We lose. We rebuild. And we tell one another, over static and over the hum of a tired generator, that we will try again tomorrow. The air had a smell that made you count your breaths. Iron, hot rubber, the flat sweetness of things beginning to rot. Days had folded into the same small catalogue of chores. Check the barrels, spin the pedal until the generator sang, read the list of names in the ledger and add a new one or cross one out. We eked hours from the day like a miser counting pennies. Then the day an extra need arrived, then another, and the ledger started to look like a wound. We were running thin, not dramatic, headline thin, slow bureaucratic thin. Bags of beans that lasted a month now lasted 3 weeks. Fuel was measured in spoonfuls. Eli saved the last cartridges for welding, which in our calculus was building and not comfort. Water was a geometry problem. The barrels behind the studio had been full after a storm 3 weeks back. They were half empty now, and the algae ring around the lip showed how long since the last clean. Someone had siphoned from the north barrel and left the hose clamped and oily on the ground. We argued about it in the kitchen that night. Voices folded low until Margot slammed her palm onto the table and said, "If we couldn't keep watch, we would be emptied out by hands that knew how to take." You learn to ration the things that feel sacred. I rationed my time on the transmitter. The voice on the air is a power and a responsibility. If I vanished for days, we would have no weather warnings, no call and response for lost children, no authority when rumors needed grounding. But staying at the mic meant not going out to barter for much-needed supplies. The studio becomes a nest and a trap, safe in obvious ways and stupidly vulnerable in others. Raiders had learned this, as predators learn the rhythm of their prey. They do not always come in force. Sometimes they come as polite strangers who ask if you have a battery to trade, or if you have spare blankets, or if you know a man named Carlos. They learn names and romances like instruments for opening hearts. And because we are human, we answer. Sometimes the polite strangers leave with the battery and a map drawn in kindness. Sometimes they leave with the battery and a hole in a neighbor's home. Either way, we are always calculating how much trust costs. The raids escalated. At first they were a rumor. Crates missing from the market. A patrol that disappeared and left a boot behind. Then they came with a confidence bordering on glee. One night they hit the far row of houses, the ones that stored grain in sealed metal bins. We heard the shouts, high, quick, and then the hammering of metal as they pried open a bin. Rosa, who had the hydroponics patch under the skylight, saw them through the tear in her tarp and called me on the shortwave, voice frayed. I told the others, and we sent a pair of guards, 2 stout men who had been farmers before the water got mean. They ran toward the noise with sticks and a love for what was theirs. 2 of the raiders were gone by the time the guards arrived. The other 4 melted like smoke into the alleys. But they had taken a week's store of dried corn and a lamp. We stitched the wound and tightened our lock. You become practice at predicting where greed will strike. Raiders want fuel and canned goods more than seed. They want fragile things they can carry. They learned to raid at dusk when people were distracted. At midday when the heat made guard shifts short. They learned to use children as cover. A woman with a crying child is less likely to be suspected. That is the kind of thing that makes you hate the world and pity it at the same time. Amid the thinning supplies and the mirrored cruelty of raiders, a new thing appeared, rumor as a tangible object. A rumor folded and passed nearly as if it were an illegal leaf. It came not on the usual calls, but as a pigeonhole note. Someone had slipped it under the studio door while I was asleep. The paper was damp and sanded at the edges, ink smudged, and it read, "Well, north, near the old mill, working, chlorine faint, midnight beacon." Signed with a single initial, R.A. working well. The idea landed like a physical blow. For a week no one slept. We measured distances on the hand-drawn map. The old mill was 2 days' walk if you took the back roads and moved at dawn. 2 days for a chance at consistent water. 2 days for a risk that could be everything and nothing at once. We began to arrange in the familiar order. Who could spare the time? Who could carry heavy things? Who could watch the transmitter? Whoever left would be away from the airwaves. Whoever stayed would keep our voice alive, but would be left with 2 less hands in a community that needed them. The rumor became a test. Who was R? Could it be Rosa, who sometimes left notes at odd hours? Could it be one of those polite strangers? Could it be a plant by a raider who wanted to flush us out? The mind is a machine of hypothesis in these conditions. You learn to mistrust the simplest kindness. We debated over ration biscuits and a tin of peaches someone had traded for a cloth of copper wire. Eli wanted to go because he wanted the pump parts he claimed were perfect fits for his makeshift motor. Mateo, who fixed the transmitter's clamp the first time it died, wanted to go because the memory of his little sister's cough had become more than memory. He wanted answers. Margot argued we should send no more than 3, small, fast, light. I said I could go if someone would mind the mic for the night shift. No one volunteered at first. The job is a cage as much as it is a beacon. Leaving it means surrendering a town's sense of continuity. The choice was not purely logistical. There is a moral arithmetic to these calls. If the rumor is false, people will walk for nothing. If it is true, staying might be a death sentence. The ledger of choices creaks when you try to balance it. That is where trust and hope intersect, and sometimes where they both fail. Before we left, there were negotiations. Someone gave us an old tarp for covering the pump. Someone else brought salted fish in exchange for a night's watch on the transmitter. Margot handed me a small med kit, bandages, a vial of antiseptic, a strip of pain pills, and pressed it into my hands like a benediction. "Don't go alone," she said. "If you must, don't tell the town you left until you're gone." It was practical and cruel. Secrecy buys an advantage, but also weakens the social glue that binds us. We moved at first light. The 2 of us, Eli and I, left with a satchel of tools, a small metal crowbar, 2 canteens, and a folded blanket each. Eli had a wire spool, and his face set into that particular look of men about to do impossible soldering. We hugged quick, rough, and then we walked. Walking is a different kind of labor now. Every step is an inventory. Shoes must be chosen for the quietest tread, clothes layered for an erratic day-night schedule. We kept our voices low and our shadows thin. We moved along drainage ditches because they offer cover and because raiders tend to use main roads. Once, we passed a house where someone had left a bicycle frame leaning against a fence. When I looked in the window, there was a doll propped on a chair with hair clumped with ash. Those moments accumulate. They make you keep moving and keep your mouth shut at the same time. At the old mill, the land smelled faintly of algae and iron. The structure leaned like a tired animal. We circled it, careful not to show our approach, and found signs that someone had been here recently. The imprint of a tire, a cigarette butt, scorch marks where a small fire had been. We moved with the slow logic of people who know to expect both kindness and a trap. Eli lifted the side door with the crowbar and listened inside. It was dark and open and smelled of stone and old flour. We called softly. No answer. Then we found the well. It was not far. A concrete ring half swallowed by reeds and bramble. Someone had rigged a hand pump above it, the metal polished where hands had rubbed. The pipe descending into the dark had a makeshift seal of cloth and tar. Water sloshed inside like the heartbeat of a thing that had been waiting. Eli tested it first, cautious, the way a man who has seen poisoned wells tends to be. He dipped a cup, sniffed, and lifted a small strip of cloth against the light. Chlorine, he said quietly. Not fresh municipal, but treated. If I had believed in miracles, I would have knelt there like a child. We filled our canteens and drank with the pure greed of a man who had been denied water. The taste was cold and slightly metallic and alive. We filled a small 5-gallon container and tucked it under an old beam to hide it. There was joy, sharp, stunned, yet the joy was tempered with 1,000 calculations. How long would this last? Who else knew? Could we carry enough? Returning to town with a single container and a story meant that the story would spread, and we would be expected to deliver. Returning empty-handed would mean shame, or worse, doubt that would fester like mold. On the way back, we found a note pinned to the pump with a shard of metal. It said, "Leave marker. Trust, R." Underneath, someone had scrawled a crude arrow pointing east. The paper had been folded into quarters and damp in one corner, as if someone had used it to blot sweat. That's when the anxiety sharpened into fear. Someone had not only tended the well, they wanted to coordinate who knew and how. There could be an organized group protecting a resource. There could be a trap. Maybe R was a real person who guarded the spring and expected visitors. Maybe R was a raider who wanted to watch us reveal ourselves. We made it back to town with water and with more questions than answers. The return felt like walking out of a long, cold ocean and finding the shore crowded and hungry. News travels fast here. The well's existence, like a stone dropped into dark water, sent ripples. People knocked on the studio door in the night, whispering, eyes wide. Some were practical. How many trips? Who goes next? Some were suspicious. Who left the pump here? Who maintains it? A few looked greedy. One or two looked as if they had already planned to seize it. The social pressure reconfigured the town's dynamics. Some wanted the well guarded and treated as a common resource. Others wanted to claim it, to restrict access, to use water as leverage. Margot suggested we form a small convoy to make scheduled runs and appointed a guard rota. I argued for secrecy and measured disclosure. Tell only those who can keep the secret and can carry. The argument turned sharp. Trust started to feel like currency you could run out of. People pair off into factions, those who would share and those who would privatize. The thing that had felt like salvation became the center of a political debate. Within days, we were more organized. We marked a trail with small, meaningless cairns. 2 stones stacked one atop the other in places only the initiated would notice, and established a schedule. 2 people go, 2 stay. We trained a scout to listen for motors at dawn. Eli worked on making a crude valve so that we could fill containers faster. Rosa built a little filtration tent to remove visible scum. We were learning rapid logistics, slingshotting improvisation into an infrastructure almost overnight. But the world never allows such happiness without cost. A convoy returning at dusk was shadowed by 3 figures on bikes. They followed at a distance, matching our pace, and waited until we slowed at a break in the trees. Then they moved. Raiders, not polite strangers. They took one of our men and left the bike as if it were a message. We found him the next morning, face bruised, pockets emptied except for a single tin of peaches and a scrap of cloth. The message was obvious. The well was noticed. That night, while the generator hummed, I sat at the microphone with the transmitter warm against my palm and a sheet of names beside me. I spoke into the static, reading weather and giving small instructions about water storage. and between the lines I wove a different thread. Do not travel alone. Cover the containers. Watch for men on bikes. My voice felt like a bandage, temporary, pragmatic. I also left an open line for someone named R. If R wanted to answer, if R was real, I would know. The rising tension was no longer a metaphor. It was a daily, visible thing. Raiders tested our convoy. Factions argued over governance. The resource, water, kept mapping new alliances and new betrayals. I felt pulled in two directions. Out into the field where I could help solve a material problem, and back to the mic where I could preserve the fragile civic fabric that mattered as much as any drum of water. I held both threads until my hands ached, and underneath all of this, a quieter fear grew, that the rumor was not a single thing, but a node in a larger machine, that others had more wells, that small communities were learning to hoard, that a map of scarcity could be read and weaponized. Hope, which had felt almost like a plan when we first read the note, now lay under the weight of possibility. Hope for water and hope for a world where water marked who we helped and who we hurt. In the green hours before dawn, I walked the perimeter and touched the transmitter mast, feeling the cold metal under my fingers. I thought of my child, of the way their small hand had fit in mine. I thought of the ledger and all the names. I thought of the note, leave marker, trust, R. I had promised Margot I would not go alone again, and I would not. But I also knew the truth that had been gnawing at me since the day the lightning had started. Hope cannot live if it is never tested. We arranged another convoy. 2 go, 2 stay, this time with scout signals and a better plan for secrecy. We would go at night, moving by moon and stars and the technique of silent feet. We would test the digging, the pump seal, the chlorine taste. We would leave a marker of our own, folded paper tucked under a rock, and we would listen. For a voice, for a runner, for R. The world hung at the shoulders like a man waiting to see whether a lover will return. We tightened our belts and our trust and stepped into the dark, knowing the next hours would carve new lines into whatever remained of us. They came on the 3rd night after the 2nd convoy. The moon had been a clipped coin, the kind of thin light that makes shadows long and suspicious. We had thought for a moment that a schedule and secrecy would hold. 2 people out, 2 in, the trail marked with cairns and folded notes. We had planned contingency signals. 3 quick whistles meant pull back. A slow drawn call meant press forward. Plans are paper. Living is not. I had gone with Eli and Matteo. We were lighter than before, carrying only a pump gasket, 2 spare hose clamps, a small jerry of treated water, and the hope that a working seal might let the hand pump keep pulling for weeks. Rosa had stayed behind with Margot to tend the hydroponics list, and the children who had taken to thinking of lettuce as treasure. I had left the transmitter to a woman named Lala, who counted my absence as a price I owed the town. The mill sat in the hollow like something that had always belonged to the land. Cracked stone, a wheel frozen in the brace of a half-ruined axle. The pump was there, rusted but honest, and for an hour we worked in the dark with headlamps and gloved hands. 2 wrenches singing, and the smell of oil and wet stone in our nostrils. Eli crouched under the pump and replaced the piston ring with a piece of rubber he'd scavenged from a bicycle tire. Matteo watched the reed beds for signs. An experienced eye for movement, for glint, for the wrong sound in the leaves. We filled a couple of 5-gallon drums and sloshed them into a tarp to conceal the glint of metal. The water was cold and metallic and tasted of chlorine the way Eli had said. Treated, not pristine, but true. We were halfway back when we heard the barking. At first we thought it was coyotes, then we understood it was men. Bikes creaked on the far ridge like metal breathing. Polly, a name we'd made up for the sound, moved fast. 3 riders, then 2 more, then the silhouettes of another 4. They were light, the kind of fast-moving raiders who run on quiet engines and a practiced cruelty. One of them had a headlamp that winked like a predatory eye. There was no time to think in paragraphs. We dropped the drums and moved for cover. The arroyo, the broken fence posts. But the raiders had already split like wolves. One sprinted for our left flank and came with the brutal, quick logic of someone raised on theft, hands grabbed at the tarp. A face I only had time to recognize as young and desperate and very, very practiced slammed me against the cold concrete of a culvert. The world narrowed to the smell of wet fabric and the noise of my own breathing. Drop the cans, he hissed, hands like iron. Mateo shoved. Eli swung a wrench. The raiders were not interested in talking. One of them produced a flare gun, cheap, efficient, and fired a single shot into the air that cracked like a bell and drove a flock of unseen birds into the sky. The sound sent everyone's heart into a run. I felt adrenaline like hot oil under the skin. In the chaos, one of the drums tipped and spilled water across dry ground, like a wound we could not stitch. We ran. We ran with a rhythm borrowed from every time we'd had to run for food or for shelter. Somebody behind us, I think it was Mateo, screamed. A body hit the road. I could not tell if it was a man or a memory for a moment. Everything was too fast. We left with one drum and one dented pride. We reached the edge of town with the sun still a thin coin, and news had already moved ahead of us. Lale had kept the transmitter on a low carrier and put out a coded call. Nothing that would name the mill, just an oblique warning. Check the east ridge at dusk. Watch bikes. Her voice was a thin skein of presence over static, calming and company at the same time. But the presence of that carrier was also a flare on the horizon for hungry ears. The raiders listened to the air, and men who listen to radio in these times are as likely to be predators as they are to be neighbors. We could have closed and hidden, kept our secret. That is what Margot wanted. Keep the well in the hands of those who can guard it. Keep it small and precious and away from the greedy. But secrecy breeds its own predators. Ambiguous trusts, rumor-fueled theft, the slow rot of suspicion. The town was fraying into factions even as we argued about how to hold the water. There is a moment, a thin, sharp moment, when a choice reveals the person you are. I remember standing in the cold of the studio that night, fingers on the microphone, the transmitter breathing, and hot below the desk. The ledger of names sat open. The faces of the people we'd passed on the trail. Rose's patch of lettuce, a child with a doll, looped behind my eyes. I thought again about my child, about a small hand and a crooked hello pressed into a microphone weeks ago. I thought about the ledger of decisions I'd made, who I had let in, who I had turned away. We had to choose between a private salvation and a public ruin. If we kept the well secret, we might hold it longer. But the moment our guards flagged or were taken, the rest would fall to whoever had the muscle to take it. If we shared it, we might dilute the immediate risk, but we would also draw attention. I sat with that arithmetic until my jaw ached. I turned the mic on. I broadcast the coordinates. Not in a triumphant shout, not out of vanity, I said, in a voice that trembled but would not break. Old Mill Well. North of the broken bridge, treated water. 2 drums, refilled twice a week at dawn. We will organize a rota. Bring light only. No weapons in line. We share. We guard together. I left the rest unsaid, but the rest was inferable. Across the air, a dozen callers breathed. Some cried, some cursed, some called for rules and for meetings. It was exactly what I feared. The town turned toward a resource like moths to a porch light. But I had chosen the risk. I would rather have people move together than watch families march alone. The message also carried another function. It was a lure. The raiders had learned to listen to radio. They would learn to listen for something that promised food or supply. I needed them to listen somewhere else. That same night, the storm came. The sky opened like a cut. We had lightning that first paled the stars and then set the horizon to a white scream. The clouds were thick with static. They lowered into the town like a hand. People hustled to the shelters, to the tarps, to the safe rooms where old mattresses and prayer mats were arranged. The hydroponic lights flickered in Rosa's patch like bioluminescent insects. The rain came not as a blessing, but as an instrument. Sheets that fell with a violence intended to test how many things could hold. Raider bikes are poor in storms. Engines drown, riders slip, momentum dies. But they had another advantage. They were used to moving under cover of chaos, when the attention of defenders is fractured by the weather. We had barely enough hands to both guard the well convoys and keep the town from splintering in panic. When the first shouts came, men on the ridge, headlights cutting through rain like knives, I had to act. There was no time to plan a delicate stratagem. We needed a spectacle, a focus. My transmitter mast was a tall, thin thing out behind the studio, patched metal and prayer flags tied to keep the wind from screeching. I had always been careful to ground it. Long copper wire into a deep trench with a saltwater pit at the bottom to drop resistance. Grounding is an ugly, practical prayer. Sink the strike into the wet earth and hope it does not find the things you love. I also knew that a tall mast in a lightning storm becomes an honest target. The idea arrived with the same bluntness as the storm. Draw the raiders away from the well by making the studio a louder, more attractive prize. Build a beacon they would crave. One that would let the convoy move water in the liminal minutes while their attention was elsewhere. It meant risking the transmitter, and perhaps my life. Eli said no, that we should not sacrifice the mast. He said we could hide the water and fight. Matteo looked at me like a man waiting for an answer he could not afford to get wrong. I thought of the ledger again and traced the names with my thumb. "Turn it up," I said. We strung flares on the mast, small bursts of color that the raiders would see through the rain. We connected the transmitter to a looped message on the emergency band. "Supply drop at studio, medical, free, come to the light." Lala, who had been on watch and did not know I'd chosen, screamed when she realized what we were doing. She tried to shut the carrier down. I grabbed her wrist. "We draw them here," I said. "We make them want the loud thing. We pull eyes away from the well. You will shut it down when I say. You will cut the line and bury the cable if it comes to that." We didn't have much time. Adrenaline can make you a better mechanic than you deserve to be. Together, soaked to the bones, we added a length of cable to the mast and ran it through the trench to the pit where saltwater waited. I knew the numbers. Low resistance path, the need to widen the pit, the risk of step potential where anyone might stand and be caught. I ordered people away from the ground near the pit. I told Margot and Rosa to take the children inside. I told Matteo to stand by the well and watch the East Ridge. The raiders came. They arrived with the casual cruelty of people who consider other humans as inventory. They saw the lights and myths of the transmitter and gave chase like hounds. Bikes churned across the mud, throwing clods like thrown off life. They aimed for the studio. They thought in terms of spoils, electronics, batteries, and the prestige of taking the town's voice. I climbed the mast. It was a stupid, dangerous decision, and everything in me screamed that way. But a mast is a conductor by design. If you can control where the strike goes, and keep the path away from the well and from people, you can sacrifice a machine to protect flesh. I tied the extra cable to my belt, because I wanted at least the illusion that if I fell, the cable would pull me to the ground safely. It was a child's idea of safety for a grown man. I took the microphone with me, not to broadcast, but to hold like a rosary. I secured the cable to the pit and made sure the connection was solid. The air tasted like ozone and pennies. The first strike came like a drumbeat. A white god split the sky and the world became unbearable light. The strike hit the mast with a sound like a mountain being unmade. The cable sang in the earth. I felt the current file through the metal into my boots in a way that made sense and then did not. For a moment I thought I would be burned clean of everything that made me human. The thunder rolled like the sea. I stayed because there was an arithmetic to the town's breathing, and because someone had traded a doll for a battery, and because a child had once said my name in a voice that made me recognize the sound as a kindness. I felt the heat on my forearms as the current found paths and melted tar and painted the world with the smell of cooked air. I saw faces below me thrown into relief by the lightning. Lala with her hair stuck to her face. Matteo with his jaw clenched. Eli with a wrench still in his hand. Small, fragile, human. When the strike came a second time, I felt the metal of the mast twist and the world fold into a single point of white. Then there was the dark. Then there was Lala's voice on the mic, wretched and human, saying my name, then the pit. A wet scream, like something being breathed into anew. I was not dead. I was not whole. My hands had been burned. My hearing was a chorus of flat alarms. The transmitter was painful to look at. The metal was blistered. The coil fused. The mast half bent like a broken reed. The raiders, who had come to take a prize from the town, found their prize suddenly inaccessible and dangerous. One of them, a boy no older than Matteo, had been the day he fixed my clamp, reached the studio and touched the mast, only to jump back with a howl that sounded like remorse. They left, or perhaps they retreated to lick smaller wounds. The sound of their engines faded into rain. We had water. We had protection. We had lost the mast and the transmitter for now. I had burns that would not be easy to treat with a town that had few antibiotics and less certainty. The well was safe because we had a plan, and because I had changed the shape of what we would risk for it. On the microphone the next night, my voice was rough and thin and mattered because it always had. I spoke about the storm and about the pump and about the men on bikes. I did not speak about the moment on the mast in detail, only that someone had kept the line while others moved water. People called in, some to scold, some to bless, some to ask for schedules. The transmitter hissed and skittered. like something alive that had been hurt and expected survival to be harder than it had to be. The turning was not only in the way the raiders slunk back, it was in the way the town organized after the strike. More people volunteered for guard duty. The rota for water runs became a thing people honored. Lale and Margot started a list of the burned, the sick, the children who needed milk. We had made a terrible exchange, a machine for a season. Machines can be fixed. People are harder to replace. Later, in the stillness where bills of rain kept falling, I touched my scarred forearm and thought about ledger entries and small hands and the choices that make a life. The cliff of the mast had been a place where my guilt and my duty met. I had been the keeper of a voice, and I had used that voice to draw a storm and a predator away from a spring. I had paid a price. That price had given us something else. A lesson that survival is mostly arithmetic, and sometimes it is sacrifice. When the lightning died and the sky thinned to a bruised blue, the town stood with more water than we had any right to expect. We had a ragged schedule and better guards, and an argument about whether we should ever hide resources again. But the undercurrent had shifted. People who had remained strangers now took turns pulling the pump. Neighbors who used to ignore each other borrowed tools. The radio lay dead on the desk, still warm with the memory of its transmission. I kept my hand on it like a benediction, feeling with a shocking gratitude the small hum that insisted I keep breathing. The turning was not tidy. It left ash and salt and burned cables. It left a man with scars and a town with a plan. It left me with a new ledger entry I am still writing into. One that says sometimes you give up your voice to keep other voices alive. By dawn, the rain had thinned into a sour drizzle, the kind that carried ash and grit down the gutters in slow rivulets, painting streaks along the cracked pavement. The air smelled like metal and damp dust, and every step crunched with the weight of soaked soil already hardening back to stone. The mast behind the studio leaned at a drunken angle, blackened and bent, its prayer flags in tatters. The transmitter's coils had fused. Copper had run like wax. The board inside was cracked, blistered by the heat of a sky's worth of fire. My hands, wrapped in bandages that Lala improvised from boiled cloth, throbbed with a steady, raw ache. Each pulse was a reminder. I had chosen to trade the machine for the town. And yet, for the first time in months, the streets did not feel like corridors of suspicion. People were already at the old mill. A rota had formed, not because anyone had ordered it, but because the storm and the bikes and the lightning had forced us to choose whether we were one town or a scattering of desperate individuals. They lined, up at dawn, buckets, cracked pots and tarps clutched in pale knuckles, waiting their turn with something like discipline. Matteo watched from the ridge with a battered rifle. Rosa parceled out the buckets of lettuce she had nursed into life under her tarps. Children, faces muddy, followed their parents like shadows, but they laughed, thin, bird-like laughter, the kind that startles you because you'd forgotten it exists. The outcome of my decision wasn't neat. It wasn't heroic. It was survival measured in sips and rotations. We had water, but less secrecy. We had safety, but more attention. Rumors had already spread. Another group to the west had heard the broadcast before the mast fried. They would come eventually. Maybe neighbors, maybe predators. I don't know which frightens me more anymore. What changed, I think, was us. Before, the town was a scattering of ledgers and debts, of wary glances and traded favors counted too carefully. Now, for the first time, we had something in common bigger than the sum of our needs. A pump that turned only if we turned it together. The well became a covenant. Not everyone liked it. Margot still cursed me for sharing the coordinates. She said one day the wrong people would walk through and take it all. She wasn't wrong. But she still stood in line like the rest, her hands on the rope, her weight on the crank. Me? I've stopped pretending that I am only the keeper of a voice. I am scarred now, inside and out. The burns lace my arms with reminders that I've touched lightning, but the greater scars are quieter. The guilt for names I can't cross out of the ledger, the faces of the dead who hover behind my eyes at night. I used to believe I was only recording the collapse, documenting in neutral tones. Now I see that every choice I made bent the story. I wasn't neutral. I was the axis of a small, fragile world. And the world itself? It is not healing. Not really. The rain did not come as mercy. The plants beyond Rosa's tarps are still brittle. The soil still lifeless dust. Rivers remain veins of stone. But sometimes, when the stormwater pools in the low places, frogs return. You can hear them at night, croaking like a memory of green. And where the dust had once covered everything in grey, now it streaks the landscape in new patterns, little temporary rivers etched across the earth. The land has not forgiven us, but it hasn't finished us either. That feels like something. In the days after, I walked to the edge of the town and looked out across the plain. It was still empty, still endless. But I realized I was no longer walking alone. Matteo followed, silent, rifle across his back. Rosa came too, muttering about the lettuce needing better shade. Eli walked with his wrench in his pocket, a talisman of repair. We were fragments, broken in different places, but we were fragments in orbit around the same fragile hope. I think often of the child's voice that once came across the radio, my own child, or maybe someone else's. I don't even know anymore, but it had called to me, soft and crooked and alive. That memory is still my compass. Maybe one day I'll hear it again. Maybe not. But I've stopped asking if hope is a fantasy. I've started asking if it matters, whether it's real. Because hope, real or not, makes legs move. It makes people line up at dawn. It makes us lift the crank together. I sit now at the dead transmitter sometimes, hand resting on the blackened dials. I talk to it like an old friend, whispering news it can't carry anymore. The lettuce is growing, the rotor held. We chase them off, at least for now. I know it's foolish, but I think part of me believes the machine is listening, that it remembers the voices it once carried, and that memory matters. The aftermath is this: we are scarred, but alive. We are smaller, but together. We are thirsty, but drinking. The storm passed, and the world didn't reset, didn't heal, but neither did it end. And maybe that is enough to keep walking into whatever comes next. The days after the storm blurred together, wet ash drying to powder, burned skin turning to scar, silence filling the gaps where static once hummed. We salvaged what we could from the mast, but the heart of the transmitter was gone. I told myself it didn't matter, that the machine had done its part, but each night I still found my hands reaching for knobs that no longer turned. The pump, though, that still turns. That still sings. The rope groans, the crank whines, and water sloshes into tin buckets with a sound sweeter than any hymn I've ever heard. It's not enough to make the land bloom, not enough to wash away decades of dust, but it is enough to keep us breathing, and maybe that's what survival really means now. Not thriving, not even living fully, but refusing to stop. Hope is fragile. It always has been. It doesn't arrive like thunder or fire. It seeps, quiet as the first trickle of water down a rusted pipe. It doesn't fix the world, but it keeps your feet moving, one cracked mile at a time. I've learned that you don't need much of it. A handful will do. A laugh from a child, even if it's hollow. The croak of frogs in a puddle that might dry by morning. A scrap of green breaking through cement. These are the currencies of hope now. Small, unreliable, but precious beyond measure. I've stopped asking myself if tomorrow will be better. Tomorrow isn't promised, and even if it comes, it rarely delivers more than a new bruise, a new hunger, another mile of dust. But tomorrow still matters, because it means we get another chance, another swing at the crank, another breath of air that still tastes of smoke, yes, but is still air. And as long as we are breathing, there is something left to fight for. The truth is, there is no ending. Not here, not in this world. Survival is a sentence without a period, only commas that stretch on. I used to dream of a final reckoning, an end to the storms, a return of rain, a new Eden blooming out of ashes. I don't dream that anymore. I've learned to live in fragments. One day, one task, one heartbeat at a time. But fragments can build things. They can build us. So here's my final message, though maybe it's not final at all. Just another entry in a ledger that won't close until we do. Stay alive. Stay human. Not because the world deserves us, not because some miracle is guaranteed to come, but because every breath is defiance. Every laugh is rebellion. Every act of kindness, no matter how small, is proof that even in ruins, humanity hasn't burned out. If someone out there hears this, not on the airwaves anymore, but in spirit, in memory, know that you are not alone. Somewhere, water is still being lifted from the ground. Somewhere, a child still asks questions. Somewhere, a scarred voice still whispers into the dark, refusing to be silent. The world might be gone, but we are not. And as long as even one of us endures, hope endures with us. That is enough.